My initial reaction was like, we have a much faster understanding of where foreign policy is going to go and the way in which we will shift our programs to meet that foreign policy. What I was sidelined by was the lack of channels to be able to say, what we're doing meets your foreign policy objectives. This is a program that should continue.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of Sustainable Investor Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with sustainability professionals in government, non-government, academic, corporate fields, talk about the work they're doing to solve the challenges they face in their environment, country, community, economy. And with that, I'm extremely happy to have Veronica Lee, who has spent the last 15 years as a USAID Foreign Service Officer, where she is currently based in Johannesburg, South Africa, leading USAID's Power Africa Energy Office, leading a $475 million portfolio helping sub-Saharan African governments overcome their energy deficiency. Veronica, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so as a starting point, tell us a little about who you are and the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, sure. So I came into USAID as an environment officer, which means that I came in with master's degrees in environmental management, environmental engineering. That's what brought me into the agency. But through environmental management and engineering, I was able to sort of parlay that career into broader fields such as energy and water infrastructure, also economic growth, meaning agricultural productivity, small and medium enterprise development, economic governance, and even waste management. So I've sort of done a little bit of all.
So you've covered the spectrum, as it were. What
Spectrum.
what brought you into environmental to begin with? Like, how did you end up with two master's degrees in the space, and then why did you decide to, take all that debt, roll it up, and go get a government job?
I came from a family where my mom had immigrated to America, so she gave us kind of a very international perspective, even growing up. And then in college, because I think I had already had so much international exposure, she's from Italy, so I had a lot of exposure to Europe. I decided in college to try and study abroad in Africa and get just exposure to some, a continent I had not seen before. So I studied abroad in Ghana, and I think there it was really my first interaction with the developing world, and I was able to see the massive and really be confronted with the just sheer disparity of resources and opportunities between what I knew growing up in America and what I was seeing even in a country as strong economically within sub-Saharan Africa as Ghana. So from that experience, I said, I really want to work in international development. That's what I want to devote my life to. So what I did actually was I went and I got a job at the University of Pennsylvania because I knew if I worked there, then I could get a master's degree for free. There were, I think, 4 programs they had where if you were an employee at the university, you could also get a master's degree after work hours. So I went to each of those programs and I said, I want to work in international development. Can you get me there? And the one that said yes was environmental management. So I actually backed into the career of environmental management because of my interest in international development, but it was absolutely the right career path for me. And I think, as I said, I came into international development because I had seen this massive disparity in resource allocation between the developing world and the developed world. And that's exactly what the environmental field tackles. It's the disparity of resource allocation and and maintaining homeostasis. I say, like, at the very basic level, conservation is maintaining homeostasis of resource allocation. And so this really, it was luckily, serendipitously, the right field for me to enter.
So tell me about USAID. I think we've heard a lot of it in the news over the last couple of months since the new administration's come in. I would argue a lot of people really don't know what the organization is, what it does, what its mission is, what's going on the ground. So could you just kind of, you've been there for 15 years, without being too policy wonky about it, like what is the work of USAID? Like what's its mission and maybe what's the work that it does out in the field?
So interestingly, I would say before this administration, most Americans had never heard of USAID. USAID, in a nutshell, is one of the most important soft power arms of the US government. It's the US government agency that provides development assistance around the world. It is the premier, I would say, the agency that provides the most of the US development assistance around the world. And everywhere we do provide that assistance, if there's something tangible that we've left behind, we leave a logo of USAID with the words "from the American people," so that everybody who sees what we've left behind is from you and me and the American taxpayer. Now, a lot of people mistakenly think that US development assistance means that we hand a blank check to one of our partner governments, but that is almost never the case. More often than not, and I would say more often being like 99% of the time, what we are providing are the skills and advice necessary for the governments to achieve their own development objectives. So, for example, if a country comes to the USAID mission, if a government comes to the USAID mission and says, we want to increase electrification rates or literacy rates or vaccination rates around the world, what we normally do is we will call on the extensive expertise, mostly of US experts, US consultants, contractors, development professionals. Will call on them, bring them into the country, and then provide advice to the government of how they can achieve electrification, literacy, etc. So more often than not, we are not giving them, it's more of a teach a man to fish model.
Okay. Now, these projects come to you. I think, obviously there's a lot of controversy around what was fraud, waste, but, in that conversation, what was lost was how are projects selected? How are they funded? How are they approved? How are they monitored? So can you give a sense of that? Like a government comes to you and says, look, we have a literacy project. We have an electrification project like in Vietnam. Like how long does it take to actually bring that conversation to a project? And who's involved, say, in the decision making of that? Is it the U.S. Embassy? Is it USAID? Is it a mixture? Is it 15 layers of approval, or is it one person out in the field is like, yes, $475 million?
So projects come about in three different ways. One, the most common is that the US government, and usually that is led, co-led, I would say, by the US Embassy in any country and the USAID mission. Often it's very formal, high level conversations about the long-term development objectives of our partner country. Then what we would do is we would start a lengthy design process. First, we would identify what funding could be available, what funding could we make available, what funding could we request from Congress. Then we would start doing extensive consultations with, we've now talked to probably the prime minister, and now let's start talking to the line ministers and the deputy ministers and start going down to the technocrats who understand the real technical hurdles and bottlenecks. We'll also start talking to civil society and even just to normal citizens, like take surveys and understand where are the bottlenecks to achieving electrification. It might be somewhere you're not even thinking. And so really by doing very broad consultation, you're able to understand a lot of the fundamental reasons why this massive development objective is not getting reached. So once we've done those really big consultations, then we can start designing. So now there's sort of, I would say this is like the most common way of a project to come about. Now we start designing. We say, now we know the problems. We know this problem could use just really some advice, some new policies, some new regulations. We know this problem actually needs some investment in infrastructure. We know this problem, maybe this problem is like a corruption problem, and what we need is civil society to kind of step in and provide pressure that might solve or I would say like shed light on why a corruption problem might be affecting bill collection or something. We might design a project that is able to tackle all of those problems if we have something like $475 million. Or we might say, listen, we're not going to be able to get enough money to tackle all of those problems. We're going to tackle one piece of this because that's how much money we have available. And we'll start talking to other development partners about which pieces they can possibly tackle. And then after we've done all of that, so that design process could take maybe 6 months, 9 months, something like that. After that, then we start the contracting process. And the contracting process itself is another probably 9 months because there are significant layers of approvals, assessments, checks to make sure that what we're doing is not going to put money in the hands of terrorists. What we're doing is not going to further corruption. It's not going to destroy the environment. There's just, tens of different assessments and checks we need to do to make sure that what we're about to put money towards isn't going to harm what's already there or harm US foreign policy. That the contracts that we put out are truly transparent and there's no favoritism in competition, et cetera. Nobody is given a leg up. So there's, just massive amounts of oversight that's necessary in the contracting process, which is why it takes like 9 months. And then 9 months later is when you probably have a contract signed. That is the most common version of how a project comes to be.
Oh, I was going to say, so, I mean, if I just take this, like, there's multiple processes, and the most common one seems to be quite involved. I'm going to go with like 18 to 24 months, really, before money's probably in someone's hands. And it involves USAID, I'm going to say locally, regionally, back in Washington, the US Embassy, if not the consulate, depending upon the country you're in, and then State Department, like all at the same time.
Yeah, so it's the State Department usually through the ambassador, but then we get into like the accountability part, and this is where State Department has even more oversight in Washington. So I can describe a little bit more about the accountability side of this all.
I want to talk a little bit about the policy side as a starting point, though, because what I feel is like there's a very long timeline on this, and as we saw, like with the current administration, there was a clear shift in policy away from D&I, climate change, and some others. And like I'm not here to say right, wrong, or other. I'm wondering how often, like, does every administration have its own, say, shift, seismic or iterative? And when they do, how much would that normally affect operations or the contracts that you have in place? Like, what's the rate of, say, new ideas, new projects to projects that are left to go when a new administration comes in, new foreign policy is developed?
Change in US foreign policy, it happens all the time, all the time. So I would just say there's like very common ones. Every single switch between Republicans and Democrats is a switch between what USAID is allowed to do in the family planning space. But my health colleagues will tell you that's absolutely expected and they know it's coming and they'll make the change within their contracts. I expected there to be a change in a focus on, or maybe like a pullback on on Biden's focus on climate change and renewable energy. That was very expected. And so we were ready to, I don't know, focus a little bit more on more traditional fuel sources for electrification in my Power Africa capacity.
Yeah, obviously this was a huge shift. I mean, D&I was out, and I guess a lot of people would argue like that, maybe not in foreign policy in the best interest of the United States. Okay, fine. Climate change. I think a lot of people at state, definitely in the careers that people that I've seen in the embassies, like they view climate change as a serious, thing that they need to be working on bilaterally with other countries. So therefore, it's still within foreign policy, but it was out kind of within USAID. And I'm kind of curious, like, I'm not even sure how to frame this question. Like, a lot of the things that they were cutting, they were saying is like fraud and waste, but in reality, it just felt like a foreign policy shift. And I'm wondering, like, how was that taken internally? Like, how difficult was this shift when it came out? And you're like, wait a second, there's just no space here. Like, how would you have dealt with that had the money still been there?
my initial reaction was like, okay, so now we have a much faster understanding of where foreign policy is going to go and the way in which we will shift our programs to meet that foreign policy. So I was ready, we were all ready to communicate how Power Africa's approach meets the current foreign policy direction of this administration. However, what I was sidelined by, and I think everybody at USAID was really sidelined by, was the lack of communication, sort of like the inability or the lack of channels to be able to say, hey, what we're doing meets your foreign policy objectives. You know, this is a program that should continue. And I think the lack of transparency was really, really hard. That was a major shock to all of us.
Was it really a shock? Like when you think back now, like that there was such a shift towards solving domestic problems, or there was such a shift to at least appear that they were moving more domestically and away from foreign. And I guess in hindsight, are there things that you may have thought of doing differently to kind of prepare for this administration coming in? Because for me, I feel like they were signaling this, and I will. I mean, it's still jarring. I'm not trying to take anything away from it, but like, I really feel like, I mean, there's a wider pullback in aid globally. I feel like we're just following it. We're just outsized, and I'm just trying to find like, have we did we just not read the road as it was coming towards us?
USAID, surprisingly, because I think people think of development assistance as kind of this like feel good, kumbaya, like approach in general, I would say. And that characterization feels like it's attached to like a more liberal attitude. But the truth is that over and over and over and over again, USAID's funding has increased under Republican administrations. And that is because Republicans understand the strength of a soft power arm present in all of our partner countries. To be frank, I've worked for USAID for almost 15 years. I've worked under 4 presidents and I mean, probably 6 or 7 different administrators or acting administrators. By far, my favorite administrator that I personally worked for was Mark Green, who was the administrator under the first Trump administration. And that is because he had a very clear vision that he communicated to us in the field that our job was to help governments set themselves up for their own development journey. They called it the journey to self-reliance, but it was very clear that that was our role. I think we all took historical precedent to be fact, I guess. And so while you can say, yes, oh, like Republicans hate foreign assistance, this feels all very crunchy, the truth is that just hasn't borne out in the history of USAID.
Now this has happened. I mean, technically it's a 90-day pause. We're coming up on 90th day. Some projects might go forward. What has been the impact locally to the organizations that you've been partnering with? You've been, bringing kind of capacity to, like, how has this affected them? And is it really Armageddon and everyone's falling over? Or is it just like, is this an inconvenience? Like, what's really happening now?
Okay, so there are 2 parts of US foreign assistance that I think need to be addressed in this question. One is health and humanitarian assistance. And for those sectors, this is truly devastating. People will die. And that is because the US government has, under let's take PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that under that program, the president announced this moonshot, we're essentially going to solve the AIDS epidemic. And in doing so, because countries had, if I can be blunt, they had very low capacity to be able to really address this epidemic internally alone, I would say. The infrastructure that was built up around the health assistance was was just maybe starting now to have a graduation path. Humanitarian assistance as well. That is a situation where, there's an earthquake in Myanmar. The US government was able to send 3 people, I think, on their disaster response team. So on that side, yeah, it is truly, truly, truly devastating for our partner countries. And in those cases, I will say the US government more often, because it's humanitarian, there's an emergency, in those cases, the US government is often giving something to the country. It might be rice grown in America, but it is something that's being handed to the country. On the other side, the long-term development side, which is what I've worked on, what we're going to see is just slower, let's say, but massive backsliding. So I'm going to give you an example. I worked at Power Africa for the last 2 years. Power Africa's job was to achieve this, again, moonshot goal of doubling electricity access and generation across sub-Saharan Africa between 2013 and 2030. So we had very specific targets. We were both increasing connections of electrification and increasing the investments in generation. And at the 10-year anniversary, we did a look back. How far have we come? What we found was that of all the energy investments across all of sub-Saharan Africa, Power Africa was involved in about a quarter of those investments. Now, that is massive, that Power Africa had some involvement in about a quarter of those investments. But it was also interesting because now we had a counterfactual. We could see the pace of investments in which Power Africa was involved and the pace of investments of the other 75% that Power Africa had no contact with. And what we found is that Power Africa essentially sped electrification on the continent up by about 10 years. And how did we do that? We weren't building the infrastructure. We weren't giving money to governments to put in new generation or new grids. What we were doing was lowering the risk. We were lowering the risk to the private sector to invest their money into sub-Saharan African economies. So here we are, like, we're providing the American expertise. We're helping governments maybe put in transparent regulations or clear procurement processes. And now a private company says, hey, I know it's really risky to invest in Ethiopia, but they have all these new, very clear and understandable laws and processes. I feel a little more safe investing my money into Ethiopia, and my return is going to be a little higher than if I invested in a much less riskier economy, like, I don't know, India or something. So that's what we're not going to see now on the development space. Is we're not going to see private investment coming in at the pace at which it was coming in because the US government. And when I say private investment, I mean really truly private developers, private financiers. But actually, we're also going to see probably a slowdown of other development partners. So for example, a lot of times what Power Africa or other USAID missions might do, if they have programs that are trying to speed up the pace of infrastructure investments in a country, what they might do is they might provide some of the feasibility studies, some proof that this project is viable, that it's environmentally safe, that the geotechnical conditions are appropriate. And those are the studies on which often the World Bank or the European Investment Bank, they might invest based on the studies that USAID has put in place. Without those foundational studies, we're going to start seeing that the World Bank is going to slow down, EIB might slow down, or the money that they would have put into investing into the actual infrastructure, now they have to spend on these studies that USAID was doing. And so we're going to just see maybe a lower pace of investment. And that is honestly unfortunate. What we're going to just see is like this backsliding, a slowing down of development.
Following up really quickly, in Asia, there's a lot. I've been in Vietnam, Thailand. I'm going to Manila next week. A lot of conversations about what regionally can be done to fill the void, but also to, over time, let's call it 5, 10, 15 years, be more resilient, to not require the help of others. That actually there's now kind of like this pushback that, like, you know what, we shouldn't have relied on, I mean, you mentioned the AIDS program, that's a 30-year program. Like, we shouldn't have been so reliant for 30 years. And this is painful, but now we're going to find our way out of it. And I'm curious, like, are you seeing that? in your region as well? Like, are they looking for money locally? Are they looking for money from other, like, say the Middle East or China or Japan, like differently now? And do you think that that makes it more difficult when it comes to like our general foreign policy longer term? Because now they're more reliant, they have more power. We don't have the ability to really engage in the way that we used to. Like, do those things interconnect with you? And are you hearing those conversations?
Basically, FDI is just not going to cover nearly what USAID has left behind, or is taking out of the country. So those countries are going to start looking elsewhere. I imagine that they're going to look more towards the World Bank and the EU. And I just don't know if the EU has um, the political will within the European Union, within its own population, or even honestly the finances to take up the gap that was left behind from the U.S. government. It's possible that there is a bright side to this. Um, I have worked in countries, Georgia, for example, was a country in which I worked, which was a lower middle income country, similar to Vietnam, where the economy, their whole purpose of development was we want to join the EU. We want to build all of our regulations, all of our policies to align with the EU so that we have a path to EU accession. They had a vision that eventually they would graduate from US assistance and move on to be a development assistance partner of their own and provide Georgian advice to other countries. And I'm seeing it now. I see Georgians providing advice on electrification to Nigeria, and it fills me with pride because I was working on electrification in Georgia. So it is possible that we're going to see some step up of other sub-Saharan African countries within the African continent. So we may see more of South Africa providing advice to Lesotho and Namibia and Senegal, et cetera. So there, I don't want to say it's all doom and gloom, but I mean, it could be a good decade before we really fully see how the dust settles on, what is filling that gap left behind.
Yeah, and like I readily admit I'm taking a long-term silver lining approach to trying to figure this out because I mean Southeast Asia is a bit different. We're also, generally speaking, the countries have one or more cities that are hyper developed now, and there's a lot of wealth that's being generated, and those national brands are coming up. They have their own stock markets, and now there's an awareness of and a capacity to even give back. And then obviously there's differences, but then they have the ASEAN framework that they can actually start to, hopefully, generationally, they haven't really worked well together, but now they're starting to kind of coalesce because they realize like there's a shared interest in working together. All right, I want to pivot. I know we could talk about this for forever, but I want to talk about you at a personal level. Like you've been in this space for 15 years almost now. How are you processing this transition? I don't think we mentioned it, but you've been told that your contract will end in September, so you're obviously going to be looking for other opportunities, whether it's to go to state, as part of that program, or it's to actually, go public, go private, nonprofit, academic. Like you have the world is your oyster. So I'm curious, like, how are you processing this transition, and is it your goal to stay within international development after September, or are you exploring some new areas to kind of leverage these tools into something new?
It's not been easy, I will say. Um, I joined USAID thinking this was going to be my forever career. I was going to, stay in it for 20 to 30 years and retire having felt I have made a personal impact on the world. I've been on administrative leave now since basically the end of February, so like almost a month and a half. So I have had some time to process and think. Um, and I would say that I'm coming around to understanding that that mission is something that I can hold on to, whether it's a part of USAID or it's not a part of USAID. I would, I would love to continue working in development. I would love to be able to do that at the World Bank or at the UN. But if we're going to be completely honest, there are tens of thousands of people in my position who are all looking for work right now, who all have essentially the same skills as I have. And so They're just, I don't imagine there are going to be a ton of those same jobs in the existing development agencies left behind. So where does that leave me? I would say, I think as long as I can hold on to the values that I brought into USAID, I can find a job in the private sector at a foundation or even just, consulting on my own that still is able to energize, keep me energized to come to work every day. So I'm hopeful that I'll still continue the mission, even if it's not at an official development agency.
So, personally speaking, what was the mission for you? I mean, you've worked on so many different issues, and what have been some of the bright spots along the way of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah. I was most energized when I like could touch and feel and see the benefit of the assistance. Like some of the most exciting moments for me were, for example, I mentioned I was the director of economic growth in Georgia, and in Georgia, that involved some providing advice and support to farmers or processors to sort of build their skills to market their foods better or process their foods more effectively to be more marketable. That was exciting to see, better, more attractive products on the shelf. But then after Georgia, I moved to Jordan and my first week there, I like go into a grocery store and I see our beneficiaries juice on the shelf at my grocery store in Jordan. And I like almost did a little happy dance because here, this person that I had known personally, I had visited their factory. I saw the struggles that they went through to like make their product very marketable outside of Georgia. Here they're succeeding. They're on this shelf at this random like corner bodega in Jordan. That's so exciting to me.
So, that kind of brings up another question, which is, what have you learned about the ability to tackle big problems through this work? General takeaways, like what have you found through your 15 years about what it takes or the potential to take these big problems and actually make headway against them?
It is slow and incremental. I think the very, very, very big problem, we can see the successes of the juice maker putting their juice on a shelf in Jordan, but solving the like macroeconomic or massive governance problems are quite slow and incremental. And that can feel frustrating because it can feel like, I'll read a report from 12 years ago and say, hey, those are all the same problems now. Sucks. That sucks a lot. Why does that happen? Honestly, it happens because government changes, and that's not a bad thing. For example, when I was in Jordan and we were working on trying to reduce water loss because the country had so little water per capita that they've been rationing water for decades. And for years, they've been trying to reduce the amount of water that's just lost to leaks and theft and poor metering. So we want to help you get there. But we're not going to just build the infrastructure for you. Instead, what we'd like you to do is you build the infrastructure and we will agree to an amount of money that we think it's going to cost for you to do that. If it costs you less to do it, great, you get to keep the money. If it costs you more to do it though, you have to spend that extra money. We're agreeing to an amount and you get to keep that amount. But we don't want our money to be at risk at all because essentially we're just giving this money to the government. This is one of those very niche scenarios in which we actually are giving money to the partner government. So what we say to them is you need to open your books to us, show us how you spend money in your government, everything from your procurement processes, your warehouse process, your HR processes, everything that goes into that could possibly risk fraud or waste or abuse of this money. I want you to show us every single process. And if we find in all of those processes any serious risks, you have to fix those risks before we're willing to give you that money. Now, it sounds a little patronizing when I say it this way, but these governments, they want, the Jordanian Ministry of Water, for example, they don't want to be wasting money. They have very little money to spend. So they want their systems to be sharp. And when we are telling them that we are going to assess all the risks of waste, fraud, and abuse in their systems, and they have to fix those, we'll help them fix, we'll give them the advice for fixing those. And then all those systems are fixed. Suddenly, that's the actual assistance. I mean, yes, we gave them the money to fix the infrastructure, but the real long-term assistance is the fact that now they have procurement processes that are very efficient. They can buy their new equipment much more quickly and much more transparently. There's not like corruption in the process. And that, even though we didn't actually give any money to that part of the assistance, that is the real like thing that we're leaving behind, the tangible piece of assistance we're leaving behind. And I think, you know, if I were to lead USAID, 15 years from now, that if we could, grow that model more and more within the agency, we would see like massive transformational change across many of the countries in which we work. I'm, to be honest, a little sad that we're not going to be able to do that. And I hope that, whoever, maybe it's DFC, maybe it's MCC, maybe it's a new agency, I don't know, whoever takes on foreign assistance from USAID in the future, I hope that that they're not starting from scratch and just doing ideas that somebody came up with, but they learn from the evolution of USAID and start from where we left off.
So, okay, I guess as a final question, like from that perspective, then, what would you say to the future USAID leaders, whatever it is, about what's at stake? Like, what's the risk of not doing this the right way going forward? What lessons should they learn themselves to make sure that even on this new form or this new policy or this new transactional arrangements, like what are some things that they should be really keenly aware of to make sure that one, they're spending the money in the best possible way, but also two, they're staying true to the foreign policy objectives of the U.S., which I would argue is more stable, stronger governments and government relationships over the long term.
I mean, if, speaking to the future of USAID, the future foreign assistance professionals in the world, I would say, again, like I said, learn from the past. Don't dismiss what happened in the past just because we've been disbanded. Take the development assistance from there and move it forward. But also, understand that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You're going to see changes in foreign policy that are technical and subject based, family planning, climate change, but the long-term objective of exactly what you just said, stable, secure, and prosperous trading and security partners and allies, that is the goal. And so anything that we are doing to move us towards partnership that is stable and secure is a win.